Next there was Ibzan of Benjamin, Elon from the tribe of Zebulun, Abdon of Manasseh. But despite these judges, the national confusion in which everyone did what was right in his own eyes grew worse. 40 more years of disobedience brought the wrath of God down on their heads, this time through the Philistines. So next it was from the tribe of Dan that the deliverer rose. But deliverance was slow coming, since the new judge was not even born when the people started to pray to the Lord for help. To further slow the process, the chosen parents were incapable of childbearing. But not long after the first prayer meeting for national deliverance, a stranger approached a certain Mrs. Manoah and informed her that she would give birth in the near future. Her husband was skeptical when she got home with her unlikely tale and desired to hear the same prediction from the horse's mouth. So next week the same visitor was back, and this time Manoah himself heard that his future son would grow up to be Israel's deliverer. He was to be set apart for God's holy purpose, drinking no alcohol and never shaving his head. Manoah asked the stranger's name. "Why do you ask my name? It's beyond understanding." They invited him to stay for a meal, name or no name. When the food was served, the stranger just disappeared, somehow caught up in the flame of the cooking fire. "We've seen God!" they screamed, anticipating imminent death. But they didn't die, and the baby boy was born as promised and never had a haircut or so much as touched a grape. Samson, they called him. Knowing he was special, his doting parents spoiled little Sam rotten. He grew into a handsome young man with eye-catching physique and unheard-of strength. "One day, he'll deliver Israel from the Philistines," they whispered smugly to one another. So they must have been devastated when the young man announced his intention to marry a Philistine girl. "We thought that he'd destroy them, not marry them." But since he'd always had his way, his parents set off to meet the proposed in-laws. Samson followed them a couple of hours later, an unfortunate delay, since a young lion chose to ambush the lone traveler, springing onto his back. Samson merely shook it off, wrung the beast's neck, and then continued nonchalantly on his way. The girl proved very much to his liking, and an agreement was struck between the families, the wedding date set. En route to the wedding a week later, Samson noticed the rotting carcass of the lion that he'd killed. Some bees had made their home in the rib cage. Samson scooped out a handful of their honey. That night they held a stag party for Samson, attended by 30 local Philistine lads. "I have a riddle for you," said Samson during the speeches. "If you can guess it by the time I'm back from my honeymoon, I'll give you each a new suit. But if not, you give me one, okay?" They agreed. So here's the riddle. Out of the eater comes something to eat. Out of the strong comes something that's sweet. In vain they strove to guess the meaning, baffled by his poetry. Eventually they cheated. They went to the bride. "We didn't come to your party to be ridiculed. Find out the answer to the riddle, or we'll burn your house with you and your family in it." Well, that ruined the honeymoon. The girl sulked and cried and begged, and eventually Samson told all. Samson was furious when the young Philistine men solved his puzzle. So he walked to a nearby Philistine town, murdered 30 men, took their clothes. "Here's your reward," he said, dumping the bloodied garments before his friends. Then, abandoning his bride, he went back home. But later on that summer, when the harvest was ready for cutting, Samson's testosterone demanded expression, so he headed back to reclaim his bride. "I thought you had left her for good," explained her father. "So I gave her to your best man. But I do have another daughter." Samson was furious. So started a cycle of tit-for-tat violence that escalated as each side, blaming the other, sought vengeance. Samson set fire to the Philistine fields, burning the harvest. The locals blamed the girl's father for upsetting Samson, so they burned his house with the whole family in it. "You killed my wife," Samson roared, and single-handedly killed half the neighborhood. He stamped off in a rage and withdrew to a cave near Bethlehem. An angry Philistine mob of a few thousand pursued him. "We only want Samson," they told the terrified local Israelis. "Well, we don't want no trouble," the local stammered. Why don't you let us arrest him for you?" So it was that 3,000 of his own countrymen approached Samson in his cave and tactfully explained the situation. "Fine," agreed Samson. "You can take me. Just promise that you won't kill me." They bound his arms and led him to the Philistines. But as soon as they saw him, he snapped the ropes, grabbed the only weapon within reach, a donkey's jawbone, and slaughtered 1,000 men. His prowess with the jawbone having been witnessed by local delegates, Samson was recognized as the new deliverer of Israel, so they made him judge. For 20 years, the fear of Samson kept the Philistines at bay. But Samson had one outstanding weakness: women. He couldn't keep his hands off them. One evening he spotted a Philistine prostitute and he spent the night with her. But he was not the only one doing the spotting that evening. The hairy man, built like a mountain, wasn't difficult to pick out of the crowd. Thinking they had him trapped, the city officials locked the city gates, planning to take him at first light. But in the middle of the night, Samson got up to head for home. Finding the city gates locked, he simply hoisted them onto his shoulders, posts and all, and walked out of town. Then there was Delilah. Samson was fascinated by this Philistine beauty and returned to her embrace night after night. The Philistines offered her a fortune to find out the secret of his great strength. So that night when Samson was lying on his back in her bed, she seductively whispered in his ear, "Let me tie you down, but it's no fun unless you really are at my mercy. How can I do it so you can't escape?" He told her to use leather thongs. Later, when he'd dozed off to sleep, she tested him. "The Philistines are coming," she shouted. Of course, he jumped up, snapping the bonds like burnt string. "Just kidding." But Samson rather enjoyed the game, so on subsequent nights, he led her to use different kinds of restraint, each with the same predictable result. "You don't love me," she moaned. "You don't play fair if you won't trust me with your secrets. How can you expect me to believe that you really do love me?" Such was Samson's infatuation with the woman that he made the fatal mistake of divulging to her the secret of his great strength. It was in his hair. "Shave my head, and I'll be weak as a kitten." She did, and he was. "The Philistines are coming!" Up jumped the bald man, only to be easily overpowered by his enemies who'd been hiding in the closet. They took him to the same town whose gates he'd recently destroyed. There they put out his eyes and set him to hard labor in the dungeon. Their enemy subdued, many Philistine leaders came to town for a celebration. They gathered in the great temple of Dagon, their god, to whom they unwisely gave all the credit for having brought down Samson. The impressive structure was packed with people, both in the main hall and upstairs in the gallery. Thousands of Philistines jammed in, shoulder to shoulder. "Bring him out," they demanded. "Let's see what he can lift." And there he stood, hair half grown, restrained between two massive pillars that supported the upper structure of the building. "God, give me strength," Samson prayed for perhaps the first time in his life. And God did. Samson flexed his muscles, and the crowd roared approval, but their shouts soon turned to screams when the pillars started to crack, then to disintegrate, bringing the whole structure down. In his death, Samson killed more Philistines than he had in his whole life.